Hey guys, I never get the endgame. Why should I study them? This is a very common mindset among chess beginners. However, I want to mention two good reasons to study some endgames. First of all, as you improve, there will be fewer blunders. The games will be more even and they will get the endgame more often. And secondly, once you understand endgames, you will be able to use that knowledge when you're making decisions from the middle game, or still more surprising, from the opening. For example, let's take a look at the exchange variation in Ruy Lopez. This happens after the moves before a5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, and a6. The main line here is bishop a4. But there is this variation where white can trade on c6, and after d takes c6, they can play d4, and there might be a trade in the center, and we can also trade queens in this line. Which is white's idea. Why do they give the bishop in move number 4? Well, the idea is that they are planning to play an endgame where they have a pawn majority on the king side, and they will be able to create a passed pawn with that pawn majority. However, black won't be able to do the same thing with their pawn majority because they have a double pawn on the c file. So, from move number 4, early in the opening, white is already thinking of the endgame, and they are planning a game strategy very closely connected to the endgame. And the second example is a little more practical. Observe this position. This is a middle game. It is white to move. A player with endgame knowledge can notice that they have an outside farther passed pawn, and this could be really good in a pawn's endgame. So there is this line where they can trade all the pieces and get into that endgame and actually be able to win because of that. So the first move, bishop takes bishop, black needs to recapture with the queen, and then we can trade even more pieces there on b8, and finally we can trade the queen on b3. After queen takes b3, pawn takes b3, this endgame is totally won for white because they have this pawn on the b file. Black king will have to go over there, and black king will be able to capture the pawns on the king side. So the game can continue like this, like king f7, king e3, king e6, and then, well, the king comes over here, and, well, as we were saying, this king will have to come over here, we come over here, and then it's an easy win. So this means that studying endgames is a must for chess improvers. That being said, let's get into the 20 most important endgame principles. Number 1, advance the free pawn whenever you want to create a passed pawn. In this position, we have, as an example, white has a pawn majority on the queen side, and they can create a passed pawn. And the free pawn is this one, is the pawn without an enemy pawn in front. So the right move should be b4. That's the one we need to advance. If we advance the wrong pawn, like a4, black can play a5 here, and then it's going to be really hard to make progress with our pawn majority. Actually, in this endgame, after a4 and a5, black can get a draw. Number 2, keep in mind that sometimes a piece is not enough. I want to show you two examples about endgame positions where we have a piece up and also some pawn, and it won't be enough to win the endgame. This position here, it is white to move, and when we bring the knight closer, black king will stay in one of these squares, c8 or c7. The idea is that black doesn't want to let white king to go out of this square so the pawn cannot promote, and we don't have any method to force the king to go away. For example, after some check, the king comes to the other square, and after the knight maneuvers a little, the king always has another square to go. Even if we give the check on c8, the king is always going to c7. This happens because the knight cannot get extra tempo. If the knight could maneuver a little and waste some move over there, then they could be controlling c8, and then the king could be forced to move away, and then, well, we could be winning, but the knight cannot. And this is the other position. It's another theoretical draw. This is the endgame of the wrong bishop. We have a rook pawn, but we have the bishop moving over opposite colored squares, so there's no way we can win this. The king will go to that square, and then we either stalemate or let the king move. So it's never a win, this endgame. Principle number 3, understand and use fortresses. A fortress is a position where even when we have material down, we could find some solid position with our pieces and our opponent cannot make progress. This is one of my favorite fortresses. Observe, we are controlling all these squares around our king. This means that the enemy king won't be able to get closer, and this also means that there won't be a way to win. Observe, the queen by itself is never winning. The queen needs to connect with other pieces, and the bishop is always going to be protected by the king, and at the same time the knight is always going to be protected by the bishop. Number 4, remember stalemate. These pawns are advancing like this, as black pawn is advancing like this. It's white to move here, and white can save the game using stalemate. I will say it right now, but if you want, feel free to pause the video. The first move in this position to save this game and actually get a draw is going to be king g6. After king g6, black doesn't have too many moves. The only move is just g2, and then we will continue with the move king a6. After this, again, the only move for black is to promote, and they have some options. If they promote to queen, it is going to be a stalemate because the king cannot move and the pawns cannot move either. But also if they try to under promote, for example like a rook, again it's a stalemate, but they can also promote to bishop or knight, but the material is going to be insufficient to win the game. So after promotion to queen, then we have a draw on the board. Number 5, appreciate farther past pawns. It has been said that in a pawn endgame, if you have an extra pawn, you have really good chances to win, but this does not mean that if the material is equal in a pawn endgame, it is going to be a draw. In this position, white has the farther past pawn most separated from the rest of the pawns. This means that black king will have to go up to the h file, as white king will have to go up to the f file. Our king will be closer to the rest of the pawns, so this means that white is actually winning this endgame. The game can continue like this: king f4, and then h5, and then h6, and then we sacrifice the pawn, and then we take here, and now our king is closer to the rest of the pawns, as we were saying. So for your own games, keep in mind that if you have the farther past pawn, it should be a decisive advantage in the endgame. Number 6, one pawn can stop two pawns. In this position, it is white to move. The material is equal. It's king and two pawns versus king and two pawns. However, white can actually win this endgame. There is only one move to win. I will say it right now, but if you want, you can pause the video. The only move actually winning for white here is going to be the move b5. And the idea is that this pawn is stopping two pawns. Black cannot play c6 because white is taking, but also they cannot play c5. White is taking again en passant. So this only pawn is stopping the two black pawns. Black can do nothing with the pawn majority. If white doesn't play b5 in the next move, black is playing c5, and this is just a draw. But after b5, they won't be able to do that. In the next moves, we are going to go to the queen side and capture those pawns, as black will need to go over here. So it's an easy win. So like king g6, well, we can just go over there and capture black pawns, and white is winning. Number 7, take care and keep in mind your pawn structure. And here I want to mention two different situations. When some problem with your pawn structure is going to create a useless pawn majority, or when you have a damaged pawn structure, they are very weak and it's very easy for your opponent to attack your pawns. So this is an example of a useless pawn majority. In this case, black has 4 pawns on the queen side versus 3, and this is what we were analyzing at the beginning of the video in the exchange variation of Ruy Lopez. Here, black won't be able to create a passed pawn. A good tip for this kind of positions is to put the pawns on V shape, and if there is a trade offer, never actually take, because then we could be helping our opponent to undouble the pawns, and then they could be creating passed pawns. So you know, V shape here, or also one rank ahead like this, and never take, and it should be enough to make sure black is not creating a passed pawn over there. Also, this shape, like a pawn on a2, b3, and c4 like this, is very useful. On the other side of the board, white has a pawn majority, and they can create a passed pawn very easily. You need to advance the free pawn, and this is another principle we were highlighting, and then create a passed pawn, and it should be an easy win. For example, we can go in front with the king first, and then play f4 and g4, and then we are creating the passed pawn over here, and black cannot do the same, so we can think of this endgame as a pawn endgame with a pawn up, which usually is a more or less simple win. And this is an example for weak pawns. When we analyze this one, we can see that black has an isolated and weak pawn there on h7. It's very easy to think that this is not really important, it's just an isolated pawn on the edge of the board. Why is it so significant? However, when we analyze the endgame, we can see that white king can go over there, get a really active position, black king will need to come over here, and then there is a very common plan to win in this position. The idea is that once the king is there, we need to trade some pawns so the king can maneuver a little over there and capture some other pawns. So, for example, the game can continue king f3, king g4, and then king h5, and then king h6. And once the king is very active, we will need to trade some pawns so the king can actually maneuver and capture some others. So, for example, like f4, black has nothing other than just moving the king, g4, and h4. And finally we break over e5, there might be a trade, and now we're gonna break over g6. So once we trade these pawns, our king will have a free path over here to go and capture the pawn on e6. So like g5, h5, and g6. After f takes and h takes, well, we have this position, and we're going to be able to capture the pawn on e6. So all these things can happen because there is an isolated and very weak pawn there on h7, so you know the pawn structure is essential. Make sure you don't have weak pawns when you get into the endgame. Number 8, understand and use opposition. Opposition means one king goes in front of the other with one square in the middle, and this also means that the enemy king cannot make progress because you're controlling everything. So the king will have to move either to a side or back. In general, in a pawn endgame, if you can take opposition, very often that's the right move. I have this example here, white to move, white can play king d5, and that's the only move that actually wins here, and it's because we are taking opposition. It's a theoretical endgame of king and pawn versus king. If your king goes in front and you take opposition, you are winning. But also we need to talk about diagonal and distant opposition. These are other ways to take opposition, but the idea is that if you take them, usually you will have the regular opposition. So for example, here it is white to move, again king and pawn versus king. The right move in this case is going to be king c5 because we are taking diagonal opposition. Now we are making progress getting the square c6, so black needs to come here to d7, and then we play king d5, and then we have regular opposition. And also distant opposition, let's analyze this endgame. Black has a pawn advancing like this, and in this endgame white can get a draw, but they need to take distant opposition. Distant opposition means there is an odd number of squares between both kings. For example, white plays here king d1, there are 3 squares, so that's an odd number, so we are taking distant opposition. And again, the idea with this way of opposition is that if we take it, usually we will have regular opposition when the kings get closer. So after this king d1, if black king advances, let's say king d4, we can play king d2, and then we have opposition. This means that we can save this endgame, we have opposition, thanks to the distant opposition we took earlier. Number 9. Opposite colored bishops endgames are very likely to end up in a draw. The problem is that once you're stopping one pawn, the enemy bishop can do nothing about that. So in general, these endgames are a draw with one pawn up. Very often with 2 pawns up, they are also going to be a draw. And I found this endgame, which is probably an exception, but I think it's instructive, where even with 3 pawns down, white can get a draw. Black pawns are about to promote over here, but if we control very well f3, g2, and h1, black won't be able to make progress. And that's something we can do with king and bishop. So the right move in this position is going to be king e2, and then black won't be able to advance. And if they try something like king h3, wanting to play g2, well, then we come to f1. Again, we're controlling very well g2. The other pawns cannot move either, so this is an easy draw. Number 10. Understand Suxuan. In chess, Suxuan means you need to play and all your options are really bad, But if you didn't have to move, you could survive and you could hold your position. So the turn to play is what is actually making you lose the game. In this position, it is white to move and white is winning. I will explain it right now, but if you want, pause the video and try to find how to win as white here. The right move, if we want to win, is going to be king c7. Observe, if we play king c6 here, attacking the pawn, black can play king e5 and they are defending and they are also attacking our pawn. So we will have to move and then we're going to lose that pawn. We are in Sukswan right now. Instead of that, we need to play king c7 first, force the king to go to a5, and then we can play king c6. Now black is in Sukswan, so when they move, they are going to lose the pawn on d6, and we are going to win the endgame. Number 11. Rooks should go behind passed pawns. Either your own pawn or an enemy pawn, the rook should go behind. For example, in this position, it is white to move. White has a passed pawn on the a file. The best move for white should be rook a2, putting the rook behind. If you cannot put the rook behind the pawn, then you should go over the side. Or if you cannot, then, well, you should go in front. But this is not so good because as you advance the pawn, the rook is going to be more and more passive. If it is black to move here, they should play rook a1. One more time, the best option is to put the rook behind the pawn. Number 12. Keep in mind 6th rank principle. This principle states that in king and pawn versus king, if the king can go to the 6th rank before the pawn, it is going to be a win. And this is going to work for every pawn except for rook pawns. So it's not working for a or h pawns. Let's see an example. In this position, white can play king e6. And even when black can take opposition by playing king e8, this is a win. The king is already on the 6th rank before the pawn, so white is winning. They can just play king to a side and then advance the pawn, and they are winning because the king will have to go out and white king can get in and they will be promoting. Number 13. In queen endgames, how advanced are pawns is more important than the number of pawns. Let's see an example. In this position, it is white to move, and white should be winning even when they only have 3 pawns and black has like 8 pawns. White pawn is already on the 5th rank. It's a passed pawn and it is advancing very quickly. The idea in these endgames is that the queen is very good guarding and supporting the pawn as it goes to promotion, and at the same time the queen is a very bad blocker. So when the queen tries to block, it's not really going to work very well because the other queen is going to make sure, guarded by the pawn, that the queen won't continue blocking that pawn, so the pawn will be advancing very quickly. So the main idea is that the queen and the passed pawn connect very well, and the enemy queen cannot really block very easily that passed pawn. In this position, white can just play a6, and well, queen here doesn't really change anything. We can just play queen b7, and if they play any other move, well, we check, and then we advance, and then we are promoting and winning the endgame. Number 14. Do not rush to resign. We have already studied some resources like fortresses or stalemate, and they can help you save some games, but also in any position there might be hidden ideas that can help you save games. For example, in this position it is white to move, white pawn is advancing like this, as black pawn is advancing like this. It looks like white is totally lost here because black is getting the queen very soon and the pawn is very far from creating any real problem for black. Anyone could resign here. However, when we analyze the endgame, we can see that the win is not so easy. We can play f5 here, and when black promotes, we can play f6. The pawn is still on the 6th rank. Usually it's not a problem. It's an easy win when there is a pawn on the 6th, but this time there is something interesting, and it is the fact that black queen doesn't have checks, and at the same time black queen is not going to be able to pin the pawn. This means that no matter what black plays, in the next move we are playing f7, and then we will have a theoretical drawish endgame with king and pawn versus king and queen. So let's assume black plays here any move like queen a1, then we're playing f7, and well, they can pin now if they want. We play king e8, and this is a draw. We are promoting here. There's nothing black can do. They can give a check. We can go to the corner. The king can get closer now, but now we are threatening promotion again, The main idea in this kind of endgames is that when the queen gives a check trying to force our king to go in front, there is a surprise. We don't have to go in front of the pawn, blocking that pawn. If we do that, black will have time to come, get closer with the king. But, well, this time we don't have to do that. We can just play king h8, go into the corner, and there's no win here. It's a theoretical draw. So, you know, the main idea with this principle is that do not rush to resign. Make sure you're actually lost before you give up. Number 15 is the rule of the square. This means that when there is a passed pawn, we don't need to calculate move by move whether the pawn is promoting or the king is capturing the pawn. This time there's a rule for that. This process takes a lot of time, but also we can make mistakes very easily in this calculation. So instead of that, we can use the rule of the square. The idea is that we can draw a square counting squares in front of the pawns. This time we have 5 squares over here, also 5 squares over here. So this is a square, and the rule states that if the king gets into that square, then it's going to be able to capture the pawn at the moment it promotes or sometime before it promotes. Or we can also draw a diagonal from the pawn to the promotion rank, and this time, as you could see, the king gets into the square, so black is getting a draw. Black is going to be able to capture this pawn as it advances. The king goes over there, and it's just in time to capture the new queen. Number 16, don't forget self-stalemate. The idea with self-stalemate is that you can create some position where you don't have any other move, and then it's a stalemate. I must admit that self-stalemate doesn't happen that often, but I find this idea so spectacular and I wanted to include it as a principle. So in this position, it is white to move. There is a black pawn here about to promote, so it looks like, well, black is going to win more or less easily. However, there is a way to get a draw using self-stalemate. I will explain it right now. If you want, you can pause the video. So the way to get a draw here is by playing this idea of going to h4 and then closing the door with the pawn, and we will be in a stalemate position. There is nothing black can do to stop this plan. Even when they have a queen over here, there's nothing they can do to actually break that stalemate. So we can play king e3 here. After b2 we can play king h4, and after promotion, well, g3, and in the next turn we won't have any legal move unless black plays a very bad move like queen f5, and then we capture the queen and then we win. Well, other than that, it's a draw. So they move the queen, there's nothing we can play here. This is a stalemate. Number 17, if the king goes to the square of the bishop before the rook pawn goes to the 6th rank, you get a draw. Observe, we are talking about rook pawns here. So in this endgame, it is white to move, and white can get a draw. The right move this time is going to be king f4. We are trying to get c1 this time using that principle, and after king b4 we play king e3. After black takes the pawn, king d2, and when black plays king b3, they are planning to play king b2 and win the endgame, but we are just in time to play king c1. Once we get this, it's an easy draw. The king is going to the promotion square. Even if they try to avoid that plan, well, we can just play king c2, and now we don't let him go out. And even if at some point the king goes out, well, we get the promotion square, so it's a draw. Principle number 18, understand triangulation. Triangulation is a maneuver we do in chess. The idea with this maneuver is that in some position it's our turn to play, but we notice that if it was our opponent's turn to play, we could be winning, and then we can triangulate to make it our opponent's turn to play, and we will be actually winning the endgame. For example, we have this position here. It is white to move, but we realize that if it was black's turn, we could be winning the endgame, because if black king goes here or here after king e6, we are taking either regular or diagonal opposition. But also, if black king moves here, we can play king f5, the king will have to go somewhere back, and then we can play king g6 and get a second pawn. Then it's an easy win. When something like this happens in your endgames, if you can triangulate, it's probably a good option. This time we can do this path, king f4, king e4, king e5. Black king can never use f7, because if that happens, we will go to f5 followed by king g6. So they will need to use only the squares f8 and e8 or f8 and g8, this means that as they play 2 moves, we will be playing 3 moves. So for example, we play king f4, black king plays, let's say king e8, we play king e4, and they cannot go too far because we are going over here. They cannot go to f7 because we are going over here. Again, f5 followed by king g6. So the only move should be king f8, and then we come back to e5. So in the end we did this path, black did this path, and we are exactly in the same position, but there is a very subtle difference and a very significant difference, and it is that it is black's turn, and now we are winning very easily. For example, after king e8 we take a position, and then we advance the pawn, and then we play king e7, and we are winning. By the way, in this position we need to be careful with stalemate, something we already saw. If we promote to queen here, well, this is a blunder, it's a draw. Black king cannot move, so we need to play something different, like for example king f6 to break the stalemate, and then we can promote to queen and win the endgame very easily. And before I continue, I want to say that the 2 final principles on this list are essential, are the most important and general principles for the endgames, and the other principles we were studying can happen in some specific game, but the next 2 principles should happen in every endgame. There are 2 ideas we need to keep in mind in every single endgame we are playing, and they are: number 19, activate your king when you start the endgame. In this phase of the game there's no danger, there won't be a checkmate attack, so your king should go out and help the rest of your army to capture enemy pawns, to protect your own pawns, and also to guard your own pawns as they go to promotion. I found this example where a king more active is a decisive factor. White can win this endgame by playing king a6, attacking that pawn. Black king should go to b8. Observe, white king is more active but also closer to black pawns. Once you get this position, the idea is that we want to trade these pawns and get the other pawn, and it's going to be a win. So we can play here b5 and then b6. After the trade, well, we are closer, so we are getting that pawn, and then white is going to be winning. We need to highlight that in this endgame, black is going to be able to take the opposition, but white is still winning because of another principle we already studied, and it is the king on the 6th rank before the pawn. And number 20 is work where you have the advantage. It means that if you're playing the endgame, you need to work where you have a pawn majority, you need to try to create a passed pawn, and in general that's the way to make progress. We have this position here, white has 2 pawns versus 1 on this side of the board. On the king side there is only 3 versus 3, so we have nothing to do over here. We don't need to advance these pawns because we are not really making progress there, so where we really need to play is on the queen side. A good way to win, just bring your king first, put it very active, principle number 19 by the way, and then start advancing and creating a passed pawn. One more time, we need to highlight another principle, and it is that advance the free pawn when you're going to create that passed pawn, and that's an easy win. So the game could continue like this, like in f1, then bringing the king to e2, probably going to c4, and then, well, we can just continue advancing the free pawn. b4 is a move here, then a4 and b5. That might be a trade, but now we can use this pawn as a distraction and go to the other side of the board. So for example, after king b7 you can maneuver a little, force the king to go back if you want, but then you can go to the other side of the board, capture some pawns, and win the endgame very easily. If you guys have any question, let me know in the comments. If you want to see the 15 most important middle game principles, check out this interesting video. I'm sure you will enjoy it and it will help you a lot. Thank you guys, like, subscribe, see you on the next.